Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared for another big episode. And speaking of big, it's been a big week for the team here at Collective Campus. First, we announced that our Lemonade Stand Children's Entrepreneurship Program was to be one of the first recipients of a funding round managed by LaunchVic, the $60 million startup and innovation fund set up here in the state of Victoria, Australia to support the ecosystem. So we commend the powers that be for their vote of confidence in our program. There's never been a more important time for children to learn entrepreneurship, to adopt an entrepreneurial and adaptable mindset. What with the realities of the exponential growth in technology bringing with it uncertain market conditions and an employment landscape that may see well over half of today's jobs automated or replaced in some way, shape, or form within the next 10 to 15 years alone. So you can find out a little bit more about Lemonade Stand at lemonadestand.rocks. And secondly, we also announced what we believe to be Asia Pac's first legal services startup accelerator. We have in fact partnered with Mills Oakley, a national law firm here in Australia with well over 500 employees, and announced the Mills Oakley Accelerator, a $500,000 program we've established to uncover entrepreneurs working on concepts to improve the way that law firms operate and how legal services are delivered. You can find out a little bit more about that at millsoakleyaccelerator.com. And on the topic of accelerators, I am super excited to bring you today's guest, Pascal Finette. Pascal heads up the startup program in SU Labs at Singularity University, where he grows startups tackling the world's most intractable problems leveraging exponential technologies. He loves technology and believes that the internet is deeply impacting mankind. He got started on the net before there was a web browser, founded a couple of technology startups, led eBay's platform solutions group in Europe, launched a consulting firm helping entrepreneurs with their strategy and operations, invested into early stage tech startups, led Mozilla's innovation lab, created Mozilla's accelerator program WebFWD, headed up Mozilla's Office of the Chair, and invested into social impact organizations around the globe at google.org. He also founded the non-profit organizations Mentor for Good, Power Up, and the Coaching Fellowship, as well as the Gai Shido movement, which we'll talk about in this podcast, and also publishes the opinionated The Heretic newsletter. He frequently speaks and writes about the magic which happens at the intersection of entrepreneurship, technology, and global impact. As a trained coactive executive coach, he works with clients on achieving their full leadership potential, but most of all, Pascal loves to work with entrepreneurs who are making things better and going from 0 to 1. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to bring to you the one, the only, Pascal Finette. Welcome to the show, Pascal.
Thank you for having me. I'm really stoked.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and you're joining us all the way from sunny San Francisco over at Singularity University.
That is correct, yes. And it's not quite as sunny today, just to say it's like slightly overcast, and in centigrade, it's about 23 degrees centigrade. So it's okay.
Fair enough. It sounds exactly like the weather down here in Melbourne. Always overcast, kind of warm, but not really. We won't go on about the weather too long. So for our audience members who might not be familiar with Singularity University, and I hope that there's not too many of them, it was founded by Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil, and essentially provides educational programs, innovative partnerships, and a startup accelerator to help individuals, businesses, institutions, investors, NGOs, and governments essentially understand cutting-edge technologies and how to utilize these technologies to positively impact billions of people. And you head up this startup accelerator SU Labs, Pascal. Can you tell us a little bit about the accelerator and your role with SU?
Yeah, of course, totally. So first of all, I couldn't have said this all better than you did. So
well, thank you.
We should totally hire you as our new announcer.
You should.
In a nutshell, what we're doing here is, so I oversee everything we do on the entrepreneurship side, which, as you pointed out, includes a startup accelerator. We also have a venture fund, a growth program, and then I teach entrepreneurship both to our student population as well as open innovation, collaborative innovation, and open source to our executive participants. What we're doing is, as you pointed out, the focus we have at Singularity University is really about these exponentially accelerating technologies. So things like computers, where this is very obvious, but also robotics and synthetic biology, nanotechnology, etc. So we teach those technologies. We teach you frameworks to understand them, and then we apply them to tackle some of the world's biggest problems. So really curious about and driven by how do you solve the world's biggest problems leveraging technology.
Fantastic.
You translate this into our acceleration program, and I think that's what makes us hopefully somewhat unique. We really focus on those startups which leverage those technologies to tackle really big problems. So to give you an example, in my last batch, I had a startup in there out of Canada. They are using a genetically modified bacteria to measure pollutants in water. The bacteria, once it detects a specific pollutant, so it's effectively tuned towards a pollutant, say, for example, arsenic, which is a heavy metal. Once it detects that arsenic in the water, it starts emitting an electric current, and that electric current you can very simply measure. It's significantly cheaper, better, faster than any chemical test which is on the market. So that's the kind of crazy stuff we're trying to accelerate.
Yeah, that's very exciting stuff. And I guess, would you say that, Peter Diamandis is famous for saying that if you want to make $1 billion, help 1 billion people. And would it be fair to say that the kinds of ideas, the kinds of startups coming through the accelerator are the kinds of ideas that can go on to help 1 billion people?
That truly is a lens we're putting on this. I just want to clarify the saying a little bit. We also obviously look at problem spaces which are much smaller, but nonetheless extremely meaningful, right? So there's problem spaces which are affect, for example, the blind population or the visually impaired population, which is by far not 1 billion people, but very meaningful, can be impacted through technology. So we're really curious about yes, these really big problems in the world, which are really meaningful to populations, and leveraging technology to do so.
Fantastic. What might be one or two other startups currently going through the program that you're quite excited about?
Well, to probably give you a little bit of the crazy side of the world.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So one of our probably better known startups is a company called Made in Space. They created a 3D printer which works in microgravity, so basically in space. Their 3D printer is currently on the International Space Station printing replacement parts for the ISS. So they've got, as of today, they've got 2 printers up there, fully operational, printing parts. And this is important if you think about if we ever want to go to other stars, we can't take, or other planets, I should say. We just can't take enough, replacement material with us. It's just prohibitively expensive and hard.
Yeah.
So you need to produce this stuff in space, which is the first step to get us to be a multiplanetary species. So that's one, which is probably on the crazy spectrum. We have a company in our portfolio called MatterNet. They're using drones to do point-to-point delivery of medical supplies, particularly in areas where this is not typically possible. So areas like remote areas where there's no streets, for example. So they developed a fully autonomously flying drone, safe drone, to deliver medical supplies in these areas. Gives you another flavor of the work you do.
That's fantastic, and I have I'm familiar with Made in Space. I think I've seen a video of the printer in action in a space station or up in space somewhere, and essentially, yeah, very exciting stuff. And today it seems crazy, but who knows in 20 or 30 or 40 years, if people like Elon Musk and Peter Diamandis get their wish, it may not be so crazy. It may be a lot more practical than what it is today for a greater number of people.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, what makes an accelerator like SU Labs so successful? I mean, what sort of variables do you think, other than going for the big moonshots, so to speak, differentiate it from, say, other accelerators?
You know, the funny thing is, I don't actually think that we are that differentiated when it comes to other factors.
Okay.
I believe it really comes down, is like, regardless whom you ask, so people in other accelerators, you ask the venture capital community, they all tell you the same thing, and like all the data points toward that as well, which is ultimately you need to have an exceptional founder team, so people who are really good at doing what they want to do and work together very, very well. You need to have a really good understanding. That team needs to have a really good understanding of the problem space, so that they can deliver a solution which actually solves a real problem for your customer. And then they need to be excellent at executing it. That's actually all pretty fairly standard, I think. Again, like the piece where we distinguish it is we just look at these crazy technologies, which are not your average, startup. They also have much longer gestation periods. I think that's another differentiator or an interesting point where it just takes longer. If you do hard science, it just takes longer to build your company. So it's one thing to build an app. It's a whole different thing if you micro-engineer a new material in the material science space, and or you create a microbe which you genetically modify. It just takes longer.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an interesting comment there. I mean, the types of ideas that SU Labs works on are, like you said, not your typical technology startup ideas like building some kind of software. They tend to be, I imagine, more costly. But again, experimentation is something that I know Singularity is all about. So if you're dealing with things like, Made in Space, or if you're dealing with nanotechnology, how do you effectively experiment without spending too much money, especially when you're trying to validate problem solution?
So actually, in most cases, these exponential trends help us. So what was prohibitively, or might have been prohibitively expensive, even like 5 or 10 years ago, has now very well become possible in the realm of like possibilities. So synthetic biology is a really good example. So the idea of like reading DNA, writing DNA using methods such as CRISPR, is pretty much something you can actually do now more or less in your kitchen. You can definitely do it in hackerspaces. So 5 years ago, there was basically no hackerspace for biology because the machinery, the setup, everything was way too expensive. Now you have hackerspaces all over the world which do synthetic biology. So you can go into one of those hackerspaces and basically just like start building. So in a lot of technologies, that's actually true, and becomes even truer as we are going forward in time, as these exponential trends help us. Some stuff is still expensive. So if you want to simulate microgravity, for example, the team from Made in Space had to basically convince the NASA crew to get space and room on parabolic flights. So the classic, like you fly up with a plane and let the plane effectively drop out of the sky. That's expensive, and that's hard to do. But again, like the team hustled their way through it and basically convinced NASA to allow them to fly on a whole bunch of those flights together with other teams internal to NASA. So, probably if you do something in these exponential technology areas, the one quality you have to develop even more than your average entrepreneur is a hustle. Because everything is a little bit harder, as you pointed out correctly.
You mentioned partnerships and the value of working with the likes of NASA. And I guess that is one way that companies who, say, have smaller budgets, startups not wanting to spend a lot of money, but looking to leverage, say, the networks, the resources, the capabilities of a larger organization. How important is it that they do identify partners that they can, third parties that they can partner up with to learn quicker than they could on their own?
Totally. So first of all, I think very generally speaking, for every startup, I actually believe that nothing happens in a vacuum. Like you're not building a startup, like 3 guys in a garage or like 2 gals and, a guy in a garage writing some code and magically stuff happens. I fundamentally believe the best way to success is typically if you partner, if you find people who are aligned with what you're doing. We spend a lot of time and we've got the great privilege and fortune to have very good contacts to the Fortune 500s of this world as they are coming through our educational programs. So we spend quite a bit of time connecting our startups to large corporations, Fortune 500 corporations, for mutual benefit. So the corporations love it because they see what's new and fresh in startup land. The startups get access to these resources from these large corporations. But I think it also works, and we do a good chunk of work there too, with on the much smaller scale, where startups help each other, or there's much smaller resources. Again, I mentioned earlier, like the hacker spaces, the co-work spaces, the Fab Labs, where entrepreneurs can now basically very rapidly build their ideas by surrounding themselves with these resources and being part of the community. I think it really comes down to, partnering is interesting because I find the term has a little bit of a transactional notion, right? It's like you give me something, I give you something. There's a transaction in there. I particularly believe that especially in the beginning for startups, it's really much more about community. So it's really about how can we create something together which is bigger than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. And you mentioned at the start of the show that you deal with the open innovation for executives, and obviously that lends itself to large corporations, whether they're Fortune 500 companies and so on, partnering with startups and smaller organizations. Obviously that brings with it oftentimes cultural misalignment, and challenges in terms of processes, technologies, and just values overall. What challenges have you come across, and how have you managed to kind of circumvent those challenges?
Yeah, you're spot on. I think the classic example is always when you see a startup starting to engage with a corporate. And you come to the point where some legal papers need to be exchanged, some sort of letter of intent or something.
Yep.
And the startup receives the 430-page document from the corporate.
Yeah.
And or the corporate receives the half-page email, typed up email basically from the startup, right? And the corporate is like, what the hell? I don't even know how to react to that. Totally, I think it's two worlds colliding. I think it has gotten better over the last couple of years, where particular corporates get understand that startups just tick differently and that they have to loosen up on some of their stuff. But we find ourselves very often in the middle, basically, as kind of the entity which translates, where we can go to the startup and say, hey, you need to understand the corporate will send you these 15 documents, and it's good. And then we go to the corporate and say hey, listen, please don't send them all your 30 documents, but only 15, and can you please cut them down a little bit? So I think there's a role for us to play to translate between these two worlds.
Yeah, and I think that's an important role to play. I've seen a lot of corporate startup partnerships become unglued just because of this, the colliding worlds. They start off with the best of intentions. The corporate likes the idea of working with a small, fun, fast-moving startup that can, take risks for them without bringing on reputational damage. The startup likes the idea of working with this big company with deep pockets and lots of customers, but oftentimes without the intermediary to translate, and whether that's an accelerator or an innovation consultancy or something of that persuasion, it can become unstuck quite quickly unless people have, unless you have people in the startup that have corporate experience, or you have people in the corporate who come from a startup background or understand that world, it's going to be very difficult.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So, Pascal, you also mentioned that you teach entrepreneurship, and a question that is often asked is, can you teach entrepreneurship? Is it something? Yeah, I mean, is it something? I mean, obviously,
Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we can teach the methodologies, but can you teach someone to become an entrepreneur?
So, spot on, Steve. Spot on. So, when I say I teach entrepreneurship, what I actually do is, I think I do largely I do two things. The first is I point people towards the right methodologies, right? And on the methodology side, I think there's not that much new under the sun. I mean, really, like ultimately, everybody should read Peter Drucker, and from there you have like your foundation, and then like there's a gazillion resources out there. So I don't need to teach all that much on their side. I think the other piece is, and this goes probably more towards the core of your question, is I actually fundamentally believe that every person, every human being is entrepreneurial. Clearly, there's people who have got like a stronger tolerance for risk, for example. So they gravitate more towards entrepreneurship, meaning starting a company, than others. But I think in a very general sense, everybody is entrepreneurial. Like we are resourceful as humans, and it's the reason why we're here as a species. I think what you can teach, quote unquote, teach is, at the very least, you can inspire people to think about entrepreneurship as a possible like potential way of starting a company or doing something. But also, I think it's really more about a mindset, right? It's the entrepreneur's mindset, and I think you can get people to adopt that, and if I can hope for anything, then if someone walks out of one of our programs and has seen me speak, that they adopt a little bit of that entrepreneurial mindset, and then you can share the lessons learned, I guess, with people, to make sure that they're not making the same dumb mistakes like I did and many other entrepreneurs before me did. So I think it boils down to that.
Yeah, and I think you're right there as well. We obviously methodology is one thing, but mindset is so important, and oftentimes it's about creating the right environment for people to become entrepreneurial. We know that Amazon has a monthly failure award where people who experiment and fail smart and do so without asking anyone for permission qualify for this. To go in the running for this monthly failure award. So when you have an environment like that actively encourages taking risks, smart risks, of course, it's going to hopefully at least bring out some of those entrepreneurial qualities like risk-taking, like experimentation, like failing and picking yourself back up. But if the environment doesn't support that, then people are much less likely to let their entrepreneurial side flourish.
Absolutely.
So you've been running a blog for a little while, Pascal, and your new book, The Heretic Book, chronicles the struggles, disappointments, and frustrations of entrepreneurship, which I guess is perfect given we were just talking about the entrepreneurial mindset and the lessons learned and not making the same mistakes that many of us have made in the past. And this book is to help entrepreneurs grow and achieve what it is they really want. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book, Pascal?
Yeah, of course. So as you pointed out, I started writing a newsletter, which I originally really only intended to like send out to a bunch of friends. And then, and this is about 4.5 years ago or so. And those friends started to invite other friends into this newsletter. And then it turned into this crazy community, which it is now. And the newsletter really is so it's super short. It's typically like 3-4 paragraphs a day or every 2 days now. And it's really meant as a kind of like, here's the stuff which is currently going through my head, and or stuff I'm picking up by having conversations with other people. It's all these pieces about like, here's some actual practical advice on like, how do you set up your pitch deck, or a commiseration of like, hey, failure sucks and it's really hard and it hurts, and here's how I personally dealt with this. And people seem to like it. So I get a lot of like feedback. It's a little bit like your companion through your entrepreneurship. So about 1.5 years ago, my co-author, Peter, and I decided to take basically the top-ish, 100-ish posts of my first 500 posts and put them into a little kind of like a pick-me-up coffee table style book. Mm-hmm. So we selected the best posts, we rewrote them for book format, and then printed them into a book. And the idea really for the book is it's not meant to be read from like cover to cover. It's really meant to be like you pick it up, like you read a page or two, you put it down and you learn something, or you get a little bit of a motivational boost out of it, or you feel a little less lonely and know that entrepreneurship is, there's other people struggling with the same crap as you're struggling with as well.
Yeah.
So it's really like a fun little book. It's not highbrow. It's not like your next, lean startup methodology or something.
Yeah.
But really meant as a pick-me-up.
No, I love that. And I think that is one of the things about entrepreneurship. It can be quite a lonely road, which is why having co-founders is so important, and why being a solopreneur is always a very, very difficult thing, particularly if you're trying to do something completely new, which has never been done before. And that approach where you just open it up to one page kind of reminds me of this little flip book that I've got called Get Shit Done. And you open it up to a page. Let me actually grab it. I've got it over here. Opening it up to a random page. Okay, it says, what will blow our customers' minds? So it's just a question. Yeah, and on another page we've got here, simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple. So that's just a Steve Jobs quote. So probably not as practical as the stuff that you've got in your book. It's just one-liners, but something to just maybe read out at a stand-up in the morning to give people a bit of a kick up the bum.
I love that. It's really good, actually.
Yeah.
I'll definitely look that up.
Yeah.
It's a book?
Yeah, check it out. It's called Get Shit Done.
Perfect.
Fantastic. And speaking of shit, one of your quotes is, you came to the realization that we all go through the same shit. Tell us a little bit about that, Pascal.
Well, first of all, I think this is the ultimate truth, right? So having had the great fortune of being in the startup game myself a couple of times, and just being surrounded by lots and lots of entrepreneurs from literally all over the world, and anything from, like your little tech startup to people in a garage type of thing, to people who've like literally IPO'd their company multiple times. And talking to these people, you just realize super quickly we all have the same issues. Like we all like struggle with. It's kind of lonely out there. It's you have to put on this mask of like everything is always awesome, right? But like even if internally like it's really not, and it's really hard, and you deal with all kinds of stuff. I think we all have like imposter syndrome. I've yet to meet a human who's like not feels a little like, oh my God, like I'm totally out of my depth here. Like, why are people even listening to me? Who am I to say stuff like this, right? So I think ultimately, like, it helped me. It's actually interesting. It helped me a lot when I started to really deeply internalize this, and I was like, you know what, like this super successful business person I'm going to pitch my business to, or this amazing C-level executive at this really big company. Mm-hmm. We all have the same problems. We all go through the same thought processes, and it's good. It's all fine. So it's helpful. Yeah,
definitely. And I think it's just human nature to see everything as a problem or a hurdle that needs jumping. We've all got our challenges, and it's just a game at the end of the day. But you mentioned that for a lot of entrepreneurs, they put on this mask, and it's like every time someone asks, "How's business?" "Oh yeah, it's fantastic. We're growing, we're learning, we're growing 10% every week," whatever it is. But oftentimes, that mask is there because they need to appear a certain way for partners, for customers to trust them, for potential investors, and so on. But how important is it to strike a balance? I mean, between projecting this image of confidence, of capability, of competence, but also reaching out to people and saying, hey, we're struggling, we need help.
Well, I think it's paramount. I think it's paramount for your personal psyche, to be honest. I've seen way too many founders and good friends of mine really struggle with this this internal dialogue they're having, which is like your external, like outward facing communication is always like, this is all great, it's all going well, like, fundraising is great, customers are growing, but then deep down inside having this like struggle with like, oh, I know it's not great, like I know that like this is the 20th VC who said no to my pitch and so on, right? And I encourage founders to find other founders, so people who are kind of in the same shoes, in the same boat, but who are not, like directly related. So not like, this is my co-founder or this is the person in my company,
right.
But someone who's doing something completely different, and really find a way for you to open up and be vulnerable with at least that one person or this group of people. As a matter of fact, Asa Raskin, whom I had the great fortune to work together, a very, very amazing entrepreneur, created this concept of the Doubt Club, where it's a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you get a group of people together, let's say 5 entrepreneurs, who meet regularly to effectively openly share, not even discuss, but just openly share their doubts they have about, their product, their company, themselves, to just get this out of your system, and also to understand and really see and feel that other people have the same issues.
Yeah, I love that. And recently an event started taking place here in Melbourne, and I think it's a global movement called Fuck Up Nights, which takes it that next level. So this isn't about doubt. This is once people have actually failed or essentially fucked up, and basically it's about getting people together and essentially sharing their failures, celebrating them, saying, basically making it okay to fail, essentially, is the message of those meetups. And people learn from each other's failures and get better, because there's no point, and especially in a startup context or in a large organization, there's no point failing and then sweeping it under the rug. I mean, if you can fail and share that failure and share those learnings with everyone else, you're going to get much higher return on failure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, Pascal, talk to me about Gaishido. I love the play on words.
Yeah, totally. So Gaishido is by the way, congratulations for pronouncing it correctly. Like, a lot of people have issues with the pronunciation, but you picked it up.
Really? What do they say?
So anything from Gaishido to, it's funny.
No, fair enough.
So Gaishido is, and it's so funny that you mentioned that word, that book about getting shit done.
Yeah.
So Gaishido really stands for getting your shit done, and is a kind of like a fun movement, which Daniel Epstein, the CEO and founder of Unreasonable Group, and I created a couple of years ago while we were basically getting drunk, and we asked each other what we think our particular dominant character trait is, and we both said really getting stuff done, getting shit done.
Yeah.
And out of that, we defined, if you say like, oh, well, that's funny, like, what is it, what you think makes that work? And we came up with a list of just a couple of like points. So something like, we both hated meetings. So we avoid meetings like the pest. And if we have to do a meeting, we'll do it walking. So at least you get some exercise in, and the meeting tends to be shorter. We have a very strict no asshole policy, which is like, we just don't tolerate people who are assholes around us and in our companies. So a couple of those items we defined, we put them on a website just sort of like because it's fun. And then somehow it became somewhat of a movement. Like, there's a bunch of people running around now, and they're like, oh my God, like Gaishido, like I'm following the Gaishido way of life. And then the craziest thing happened. An absolutely amazing design agency called Dojo 4 came to us and said, hey, we like this so much, we created a poster. It's a beautifully designed poster. Do you want to just put this on your website? And like, we basically sell it at cost. And I was like, that's amazing. So now there's a whole, like, there's a poster and everything. So it's one of these fun things. It's just like, I think this goes back to like being entrepreneurial. It's like sitting together, coming up with some crazy idea, and then just like, okay, let's put the website out. And, we Gaishido'd the website. We just took us a day, and then a design agency came and sent us this poster, and then it took us another day to just basically set up a basic store, and so now it's in the world, it's out there.
Yeah, that's hilarious. What's the website where we can get that poster?
So you get the website and the poster at guyshido.com, and Guyshido is GYSHIDO and then .com.
Fantastic. That actually, that drunken idea story reminds me of a friend startup. They were sitting around one night drinking beer and said, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool if we created a happy socks company with a button so that you could keep these socks together when they're in the wash." And they went on to build this company, and it's recently struck a massive distribution deal with one of the largest department stores here in Australia, and all over a few drunken beers. So it's funny how that happens. On emerging tech, Pascal, and being from Singularity University, we simply can't end this chat without talking the singularity. SU co-founder Ray Kurzweil describes his law of accelerating returns, which predicts an exponential increase in technologies like computers, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, and artificial intelligence. He says this will lead to a technological singularity in the year 2045, a point where progress is so rapid it outstrips humans' ability to comprehend it. At this point, machine intelligence will be infinitely more powerful than all human intelligence combined, and that humans will augment their minds and bodies with genetic alterations, nanotech, and AI. Do you have any thoughts on the singularity and what this might mean for us, Pascal?
That's a really good question. And it's a good question. I say, typically, this is a question where we would get the bottle of wine out and have a very deep, long conversation.
Maybe I can fly over for that one.
That sounds fantastic. And bring some of your wine with you.
Will do.
So I think the short version of this is, if you condense it down to just computers, I think that's probably a little easier to comprehend.
Yep.
So we're still seeing these doublings in computational power as predicted by Moore's law, and although Moore's law is slowing down and or changing a little bit, there's good reason to believe that we will see many of those increases for decades to come. We will come to a point when you will have a machine which has literally the raw compute power of a human brain. That will happen somewhat soonish. So if you believe Ray, it's going to happen in about 15 years. By which point you have machines which are as smart not meaning conscious, right? Smart just meaning like purely brute force smart, as humans. And you can already sense and feel a little bit like what that future will look like when you look at the advances we are seeing currently in artificial intelligence. So when you see how smart and how good your Google Now has become, or your Microsoft Cortana, or your Apple Siri, and granted, they're still very much like touching the surface, but Google Now, for example, on my Android phone, it remembers when I stop my car for parking it, it realizes, oh, the car is parked, so I mark it on a map so I can actually find my car afterwards. When I do appointments, it starts to suggest people I should invite into my appointments, right? So there's these little pieces, bits and bobs where the machine becomes a real interesting augmentation to us, like a real smart butler, assistant. And I think that's probably one of the first things we will see. And before we know, we will take this very much for granted. So you will probably, in a very near future, you will just have your smart assistant sitting in your computer, and you will say, hey, like I want to learn everything there is to learn about the city of Melbourne. Can you please go out, combine all the resources, and create a 2-page summary for me because I'm traveling to Melbourne and I want to know what's important, right? Also, I want to, on that report, the coolest bar in Melbourne. Can you please find that out as well? And this machine agent will like go out into the world for you, the digital world, and pull those pieces together and understand them, contextually understand them, and put them together in a report. So we will move. I think we will move very quickly in a world which is really interesting and very dramatically different, and will allow us. And this is the thing, will allow us to do more and better things. Because now we don't need to waste our time, our human brain time, the creative time we have on stuff like research, for example.
Well, funnily enough, that actually reminds me of a quote from Terminator 2, of course, Arnie.
I'm a cybernetic organism, living tissue over a metal endoskeleton.
Interesting to see how this pans out over the next 15 years. I know Ray Kurzweil was saying 2029 would be that year that we would get that advanced computing power where it's actually smarter than a human brain.
Absolutely. And if what I hear from a little bird is correct, Ray is actually currently going to revise or refine some of his predictions. So I think in the next couple of months, probably, we will have an interesting revised view into his view of the world.
Wow.
By the way, to counter your Terminator quote, I love to quote Sarah at the end of Terminator. Oh my God, 2, 3. No fate but what we make.
That's fantastic. Well, we could be doing Terminator quotes all day if it was up to me, but we'll
sure.
end the Terminator quotes there, Pascal. It's time for our lightning round. So this is where I ask all of my guests 3 questions, 2 hypotheticals and 1 on lifestyle design. Are you ready, Pascal?
We'll try. Sure.
Fantastic. So question number 1 is, if you could work for any company at any stage of the company life cycle, who would it be and why?
Xerox PARC in the mid-late 60s, because Xerox PARC invented roughly 50% of what is modern-day computing during those 7 years.
Yeah, fantastic. And would you have done anything differently if you were at Xerox PARC and working for them than what they did?
No. Well, I would have probably tried to commercialize the Altos, which then became Macintosh and Windows.
Yeah, that's the answer I was hinting at. Question number 2. If you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Whoa, that's a really hard one.
It is.
Good question. If I could ask anyone a question. And this being a lightning round, I need to be quick.
Well, we can always edit out the umming and ahhing later.
Nice. Good one. I think I would ask Albert Einstein how it was that he didn't give up when basically everybody told him he was an idiot when he left when he was in the patent office working on the unified theory of relativity, and literally everybody told him he's nuts.
Well, I guess he must have had what Steve Jobs alluded to, or what Steve Jobs called the reality distortion field.
Clearly.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that is also something that is quite critical for entrepreneurs, particularly early stage entrepreneurs, where there are so many unanswered questions pertaining to problem solution, fit, product market fit, business model, and so on. You need to have a healthy dose of reality distortion to stick to your guns. And finally, the last question is on lifestyle design, Pascal, and this is one where I just ask people, how do you stay on top of your game? Do you have any rituals or routines? I mean, you've mentioned Gaishido, and I know you talk a little bit about being founder fit. So how do you stay on top of your game?
I think you need to have whatever feeds your soul and your body, which allows you to step away from the work. So for a really long time, I'm currently not doing it because I'm injured, but for a really long time, I was a ultra distance runner. And being on the road, like running for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours at a piece is incredibly freeing for me. It's meditative for me. I think you need something like that. It doesn't need to be the running, right? But figure something out which allows you to step away from what you're doing and gives you the mental space between you and your work.
So ultra running, that's essentially 100 kilometers, is that right?
Yeah, it's technically anything beyond the marathon. But I was mostly focused on 50 miles.
Wow. That for our Australian listeners, I believe, equates to about 80 kilometers.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. That's quite an effort. And yeah, anything that can essentially take you into flow as well and just put your mind, get your mind to stop thinking so much, I find often helps, and also helps you innovate better as well. If you are an entrepreneur, you're going to come up with your best ideas when you're in a space of unperturbed flow. So where can people go to find out a little bit more about you and connect, Pascal?
Absolutely. So probably the easiest way is literally and you mentioned this earlier, my newsletter. So if you go to theheretic.org, that's where you find the newsletter. There's a whole newsletter archive. There is contact information about myself. There's also a couple of links which go to all this other stuff I'm doing. So that's probably the easiest way for anyone to to find me.
Fantastic. And finally, I have to ask, what's it going to take to get someone like a Peter Diamandis or a Ray Kurzweil on the show?
Perseverance, my friend.
Yes, the entrepreneurial mindset will get us there. I'll report back once we lock them in.
Sounds good.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for giving up some time this afternoon, Pascal. You've been an awesome guest, and we'll make sure to share all those links for our listeners so they can find out a little bit about yourself, about the Heretic, maybe get a copy of the book, maybe connect with you, and so on. So thanks again.
Steve, thank you so much. This was fun.
Well, that's it for my chat with Pascal Finette. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I had an absolute ball chatting with Pascal. As always, you can find out a little bit more about Collective Campus and about Future Squared at www.collectivecamp.us. You can access lots of free resources there, be they blogs, podcasts, videos, webinars, and so on. So check that out for your viewing and listening and consuming/reading pleasure. If you're picking up what we're putting down, if you're liking the caliber of guests I am bringing you, then it would really help us out if you took just 30 seconds of your time. I usually say a minute, but we're going to bring it back to 30 seconds. Let's A/B test that. To like, share, or subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a lot to me and the team here at Collective Campus, who keep working tirelessly to bring you guests of the caliber of Pascal Finette. So until next time, watch out for that singularity. Future Squared out.